First of all, I'd like to thank Tiziano for inviting me here to this beautiful part of the world. If you imagine, if we were, at a music festival right now, and I'm sure most of you would rather be at a music festival right now, I would be the opening band. And no one goes to a music festival to see the opening band, right? You all go to see the headliners. James Brown and Michael Jackson right here, right? But the job of an opening band is to warm up the crowd, right? So my talk is going to be a little bit less theoretical than I usually approach this topic, but I want to share with you some ideas based on empirical research I've done with key actors in the music industry. And I'm going to approach this topic of platforms from the perspective of data. And we got this nice introduction by Tiziano, and he quotes Nick Sorenicek, yeah. He talks about the importance of data for platforms. But I'm not going to talk so much about data as a commodity, but I want to look at how data organizes meaning within industries, how people make sense of industries in an era with this proliferation of data. So let's get started. Now, the presentation and representation of culture and the valuation and evaluation of cultural products has always involved cultural intermediaries. And when academics discuss cultural intermediaries, they're usually talking about people. People like TV or radio producers, journalists, critics, maybe jobs that some of you want to do later on. But as Liz Moore writes, non-human or material forms of agency can be just as significant as contributors to intermediary or mediating activities as human ones. Cultural intermediaries don't have to just be people. They involve things as well. And now some work has been done on this. For example, the scholar Jeremy Morris has looked at recommendation services and the algorithms that constitute them as a particular type of cultural intermediary. And he uses the term infomediary, combining information with intermediary, right? Looking specifically at the role of information in the representation and presentation of cultural goods. Now, in the case of the music industries, there are many infomediaries that you can identify. Some of them will be familiar to you, some of them not so much at all. We have, for example, specialized services like the French Paris-based Sound Charts, which is this aggregator of all this data in the music industry, and it's a business-to-business service, so if you work in the music industry and you want to find data about the music industry, you might subscribe to this service. Another one is the London-based Entertainment Intelligence, and maybe you can see the small writing here. We don't just show you numbers, we produce clean, precise, and actionable insights so that you and your team can make the most efficient and informed decisions to nurture and grow your entire ecosystem. Another one here is Next Big Sound from the US. Here you see they're comparing three artists, Tiziano's favorite artists here, Nicki Minaj, Lady Gaga, and Carly Rae Jepsen. And it's almost like a stock portfolio where you're comparing your stocks and seeing which one has grown in relation to another one, and you can compare these artists in real time. Now there's other more familiar infomediaries. Are there any musicians here in the room? Any aspiring musicians? Anybody have any songs on Spotify? Yes? Okay. So you maybe know Spotify for Artists. This is also can be seen as infomediary. For artists, you can get access to your real-time data. You can see how you're doing as a musician. And of course, even more familiar for everyone, are social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube, which also provide analytics for those in the music industry. But the rise of intermediaries such as these in shaping and even automating how culture is presented and represented doesn't mean that machines are replacing people as cultural intermediaries. Cultural intermediation is always a process. It has always involved this combination of human actors and technical devices. But in an era of datafication, this intermediation, this process of intermediation has been affected in subtle and not so subtle ways. So my current research, I'm looking at how music industry workers, specifically musicians, music managers, and A&R staff, artists and repertoire staff, the people who find the bands in the bars and develop their careers, the talent scouts, how they incorporate these new sources of data, this rapidly proliferating new sources of data. Because every time you listen to music, you're providing some sort of data, right? And what do they do with all this data? How do they make sense of it? As there's so much data swirling around, that the problem that I found in my interviews that confronts everyone in the industry, from the indie label artist to the CEO of Sony Music, is how to make sense of this data. And so an interview I did with the CEO of Soundcharts, he said, it's never been so easy to make and listen to music, but it's never been so hard to actually know what the hell is going on. And my interviewees really confirmed this type of frustration. One music manager said, what I find most annoying is that we have some programs that can give us insights and data, but the first one is over here, the other one is over there. They all say something different. That's the most frustrating thing. Another music manager echoed this. He said that presenting the data is one thing, and interpreting it is another thing. Most of the time, I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at. I need someone to interpret it for me. And this is the thing, in their apparent transparency and ease of use, social media platforms like Facebook, real-time dashboards like Soundcharts, or analytics services like Spotify Artists, they provide this sort of sense of what Todd Gitlin, the sociologist, once called the fetish of immediate numerical gratification. You feel like you're getting insight, that this is a transparent world. But as many scholars have recognized, the challenge of big data is not in sorting data, but in figuring out how to make sense of it. As one manager told me, it's one thing to have all that information, it's another thing to know what to do with it. And another A&R artist, or an A&R staff member, said, that's great that he used this analogy. He said, it's great that you're behind the dashboard, but if you're in Airbus 380, and you're suddenly sitting there and you're going, what do I do with all these, blinking lights? Of course, this doesn't mean that music professionals aren't trying to make sense of all this data. My interviewees explained to me in detail how they try to go through all this data, how they try to figure out what to pay attention to and what to ignore. For example, one artist manager, he explained to me how he's recently spent a very late night sitting down at the computer, taking all of his group songs. He represented a drum and bass group in the Netherlands, and he downloaded all that group songs onto an Excel sheet, and then he calculated the percentage of saves to streams. So the number of streams that each song was getting on Spotify, and then the number of saves, because he figured the higher the saves were, the more that gave you insight. Or as he said, that's something that Spotify sees too. When a song has a high percentage of saves to streams, it has many advantages for us. Then Spotify rates that song higher as well. So he's trying to figure out how he can sort of reverse engineer Spotify's algorithm. And he figures that saves is an important way to look at this. Now, this is an example of what the media scholar Tanya Butcher called algorithmic imaginaries. How different ways of thinking about how or what algorithms are and do may affect how these systems are used. So this is the way that people imagine or perceive and experience algorithms and what those imaginations make possible. Imagining how Spotify's algorithm works directly affects how an artist or an artist manager chooses to release their music, chooses to promote their music, what playlists that they try to get their music at for. For this manager that I was just talking about, what he does with this is he says that, well, he tries to aim at smaller playlists because those are the people who want to hear exactly what I have to offer, basically. Then you hopefully get a lot of saves per stream. So rather than going to the big playlist where there's more people, if you're trying to get more saves by listeners, you go to the smaller playlists. Now, as Spotify's playlists become an increasingly important way to break new music in the music industry, as they become more important than radio than has been traditionally, record labels and artists are obsessing about how to secure the right position on the right playlist. And so there's a lot of hype around skip rates, for example. And a skip rate is if you listen to a song and you skip it before 30 seconds is over, it doesn't count as a listen. And so, of course, you want to get the listener past the 30-second mark, so it counts as an actual listen. So there's all this type of, grassroots theorizing about how to prevent listeners from skipping. And as one A&R manager told me, a lot of kids are saying, I want to be in this top 10 of the playlist. Yeah, right. If you're up there with Chance the Rapper or Rihanna, and then also your song, your skip rate is going to be enormous. If you're between the big guns, more likely they'll skip you. They don't know you. Now, recently, a Spotify executive tried to kill this myth in a talk he gave. But myth or no myth, the story about how Spotify's algorithm works exists. And everyone is trying to figure out what the key metrics are in this new music industry and how they can adjust their actions accordingly. And this doesn't affect simply what playlist you put your song on, but also how you actually produce that song. There is anecdotal evidence that it's changing how people are writing and producing songs in the first place. There's some evidence that songs are trending shorter, that the choruses are coming in earlier. There's often an enormous introduction followed by a succession of repeated hooks because, of course, they want to get you past the 30-second mark, right? The point is, regardless of what's actually happening at Spotify, regardless of what's actually going on beneath the hood in that black box, because that's proprietary information, right? Only Spotify knows. It's the popular stories and the imaginations of what's going on that's already changing music production and distribution. Now, with all this data that's now available, it's just as important for musicians, managers, and record labels to figure out what data not to pay attention to. So an Australian music manager, she told me that she recently discovered that her band was huge in Spain. And she said that was quite surprising for her because she said, we haven't even been there, which is so ridiculous. Now that's obviously a huge priority for us to go to Spain. But as soon as she said that, she started to express doubts. And she said, well, what if the data is wrong? What if it's just a group of expat Australians who are living in Madrid or something, who just stream the band over and over again? Maybe it's not a legitimate organic thing. It can be hard to make decisions if you don't know the data in and out. And interviews that I've done in A&R departments, the people who scout new musicians, new artists, have also talked about this. How a big part of their job is to try to filter data, to try to figure out what's actually going on. As one A&R rep said, sometimes you say, how did I miss this? There's 10 million streams. Hang on, nothing happening on Snapchat, nothing happening on Instagram. Then you start to think like, okay, something's not quite right over here. So it's knowledge about platforms and what information to trust, which information to somewhat be careful about. But it's also knowledge about which genres fit with which platforms. You could call this like the genre affordances of different platforms. For example, hip-hop is huge on Spotify. So a Dutch A&R manager for a large international publisher, he said, well, generally speaking, hip-hop guys are very young. They can listen to a song 10 times in a row. That makes for extreme numbers. There are a small number of people who listen to a song 20 times in a row, 30 times in a row, and they follow everything, and they live online. So how do you compare that to another genre where maybe the fans don't live online? How do you commensurate between these numbers? Another A&R rep said this: you always try to relate what market it is, because if you go urban music, 20 million streams in 3 months, maybe on YouTube. Then you compare the same act, a rock or alternative act, the same time of release over the same weeks, and you'll see a huge difference. To me, he continued, if I see 20 million streams, those are the kids and the one-off hits. So what's interesting about this is this A&R manager is drawing on his knowledge of the field, of his intuition. Now, I came into these interviews, and I think it's reasonable to assume that many professionals who have a lot of experience in these industries would resist all these tools of quantification, all these new sources of data. And this is, for those of you who know something about the music industry, you know that there's a lot of romantic stories about the A&R scout who has this golden ear, who just can walk into a bar, he can hear the next big thing, he or she, typically it's been a he historically, and just know who will be the next big artist, right? They have this instinct, right? This gut instinct to know. And you can imagine that a lot of these people with years and years of experience would resist all these numbers and be like, hey, I'm not going to follow these numbers. I know. I can hear when something's going to be a hit or not. As Wendy Espeland wrote in a really great article from years ago, that the legitimacy offered by numbers diminishes autonomy, because discretion is replaced by disciplined methods. She continued, this is why quantitative technologies are resisted by those whose authority depends on expert judgment, character, or informal knowledge. And I saw this to some degree. There were A&R reps who resisted this move towards data-driven A&R, where you don't have to go to the bar anymore to listen to a band. You just sit there on the computer and you find out who's big on Shazam and who's trending in other sources, and you can do it all there, right? But for most of the part, my interviewees made it clear that they didn't so much resist numbers as they tried to relate data to other sources or other ways of knowing. And in my interviews, it was interesting because there's a lot of reference to gut feelings. As this A&R rep said, there's a lot of data, but there's a lot of gut feelings still involved, actually. Almost every one of my interviewees talked about how they filter these numbers through their gut. This is what some scholars have called a feel for numbers. So I think you could say that rather than datafication, kind of coming in from the outside and transforming the industry, it's more likely that datafication is being incorporated into pre-existing, taken for granted principles of evaluation, or what some scholars call orders of worth, that structure decision-making in the music industry. But there's also this clear, I think, generational divide. I remember talking to a Sony executive, a young guy, who was complaining about the older, experienced A&R reps in his industry who didn't want to do anything with didn't want anything to do with these numbers, and he was saying that they were just stuck in their old habits. And last week, or a couple of weeks ago, Sony Music, one of the big 3 record labels, they bought this analytics platform called Sodatone, a Toronto-based platform, which is really set up as an A&R platform that is there to automate the discovery of new talent. So it'll be interesting to see how A&R professionals, how they deal with these new sources of information, because they are also somewhat, you could call them as threats to their professional identity. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit because, not surprisingly, musicians are perhaps most personally affected by infomediation. And as it became clear in my interviews, musicians are very aware of their own data, their own metrics, how they're doing in real time. And this has interesting effects at a personal level on these creative professionals. There's a big difference between being a musician now and being a musician in 1998 when I wanted to be a musician. Back then, you might have had some access to your own sales figures. You might have known how big the bar was that you could fill to capacity, or how big your email mailing list was. But now, that's a huge difference from now, where you can see in real time your YouTube numbers, your Spotify plays, and so forth. And a Dutch DJ, he confessed to me, in my opinion, what sucks the most about the internet is that you can see the plays. So this transparency that we all think is so great, for creative producers, it's a little bit hard. So you're going to think this last one had 6,000 plays, and this one only has 4,000 plays. He continued, it's not because you're going to immediately make a different song. Not because you're going to use it in any instrumental way. But it's also feedback that's not always so nice. Now, many musician interviewees that I've talked to, they express this type of disillusionment or disappointment when their metrics didn't live up to their expectations. I talked to a trip-hop artist who told me about how disappointed she was. She released a video recently, and she paid for it to be promoted on Facebook, and she was very disappointed with the number of likes that it received. The number of likes in comparison to plays. She had 1,500 plays and only about 25 likes. For her, this was a bad ratio. This was a small number of likes to overall plays or overall views. She said, I started thinking, is it not good enough? You know, the usual thoughts. Now, of course, artists have always had to interpret information or feedback from their audiences in real time when they're performing, from music critics and so forth. But now there are new actors generating new forms of mediated knowledge that must be taken into account. So this requires new practices of contextualization. How do you put these numbers into context? How does she do this? So some musicians, they talked about how they try to contextualize metrics. A Dutch singer-songwriter, he told me that he makes a difference between the ratio of likes to views on Facebook and likes to views on other platforms like YouTube. He said, I think there's a difference between really watching a video on YouTube and just scrolling over it and it starts playing on Facebook, because that's counted as a view too. What he's doing right here, in this very, common sense explanation, but what he's engaging in is what scholars call practices of commensuration. The transformation of different qualities into a common metric. Because you're constantly doing this, right? You're trying to, and especially in these new fields with new sources of data, when fields are undergoing rapid change, new sources of data come in, and you have to somehow interpret them in relation to older sources of data or in relation to each other. So it's an active translation. And he's pointing out how different platforms measure engagement differently. And that you need to recognize this distinction between the platforms. He also told me that he doesn't want to take the likes he receives too seriously because he can't assume the same intention behind every like. He says maybe they just click away. There's not a real reason. Maybe, hey, it's just, hey, this guy's from my city and he's on the radio. How cool. And here we're getting into, you know, the apparent transparency of online data. Like a simple like betrays the number of possible different interpretations that lay behind it. As social media scholars have written about, the like button is a one-click shortcut to express a variety of effective responses, such as excitement, agreement, compassion, understanding, but also irony and parody. Just think for yourself how many times you like something and how many times there's a different reason behind that like, right? The collapsing of all these different effective responses into one standardized metric, like a like or a thumbs up, is compared by this singer to the type of contextualized feedback that he gets at live performances. He says when you're playing at a venue and people come over to you and they say they like your songs or your voice and how the band plays together, or even if they don't like it, there's a reason behind it and the night itself, the venue and how it went and how you think it went. But online spaces, online platforms are not just spaces that lack context, but they're spaces with their own politics and practices of commensuration. With these comments, this musician is pointing out that, as Nick Couldry and Andreas Hepp write in their recent book, that social media platforms feel like spaces where we encounter others, right? We feel like we're engaging with others on there. But this existence is shaped by their underlying operation of platform software and its calculative metrics. And of course, we have no access to this. We don't know how the calculations are made by these platforms. These platforms are also shaped by new social norms and expectations of reciprocity that are still in very early stages of development. For example, between musicians, and I heard this a lot when I talk to musicians, between musicians, a like is often used as a medium of exchange. As one artist told me, when another artist, like a friend of mine, has a new single, I will like it for them, right? She will give them a like. But then I talked to people and they said, I saw your video, but they didn't press like, so I thought, why not? So she's confused here because she doesn't understand, because if she was performing live, her friends would, you know, give her a round of applause, they would clap for her. And so she's trying to translate that onto an online space, and it doesn't have the same norm, or the norm hasn't developed in the same way. So she sees a like as an online equivalent of a round of applause, but of course, other artists perhaps don't see it in the same way. So she writes, or she told me, I feel like so many people saw this video that she was talking about, but they did nothing. I felt quite insecure for a few days. And then I felt, oh man, what am I doing? I don't want to do this anymore. I lost my drive a bit. So the importance of developing these sort of shared understandings, or understandings of what a like means, is not just simply an issue of etiquette, but it actually affects cultural producers like musicians and their very sense of self-worth and professional value. Now this brings us to the issue of power. Now, of course, when you're talking about the political economy of platforms, you always have to understand or acknowledge relations of power. And broadly speaking, I would say that there are two types of power in relation to infomediation, in relation to what I've been talking about. And the first, I think we can call strategic power. And this is the capacity to reflect one's will through processes of infomediation. Sorry, the R shouldn't be there. Infomediation. And this is using data to try to maintain or upend traditional power relations in the industry. The second one we could call constitutive power. The capacity to alter and even create new categories. And I think this is even more important here. Because once you create a new category of measurements, people's behaviors start to act in response to that. Think about the census, right? The US Census creates a category for Hispanics. Hispanics are people from a wide variety of different cultures and nations, but they're grouped together in one category. But that category exerts a power of its own in shaping how people see themselves. Now, this isn't the obvious power of coercion, but the more elusive passive power of discipline. So the question is, can we see these types of power emerging within the music industry in relation to data and infomediation? Now, the CEO of an Amsterdam-based digital distributor told me this. The music industry, he says, in the past has always been thriving off of an information asymmetry, or information not being available to all, because it gives specific power to specific partners in the industry. And what I would argue we can see in this era of datafication, as more and more forms of data emerge, is that this information asymmetry has actually increased. Almost all of my interviewees commented about how the big three major record labels, Sony, Warner, and Universal, how they had access to more data, better means of data collection or aggregation. They had better data teams, in-house data teams and services for their artists than the independents were. And so it's interesting because we kind of went through a period 10 years ago where there were a lot of arguments about, well, you didn't need to sign to a record label anymore because you can just release your music online and everyone can hear it. But now you see that the majors have reasserted their dominance in this way of having better access, having more money to pour into data analysis. And even if you're an independent record company and you want to subscribe to a service like Soundcharts, well, you have to pay about €300 a month for this subscription, which is quite a bit if you're a small indie label. As one of my interviewees said, smaller labels or independent labels don't really have the internal resources to be able to ask the complicated questions. Now, there are some indications of resistance to this that I don't have time to get into right now, but as my research continues, I'm curious about how this sort of power balance, right? How the new music industry, how some of them are using data to try to maintain traditional power relations between the major labels and the indies, or how indies are using data to try to upend these power relations. But perhaps an even more interesting form of power, like I said, is called constitutive power. And this is the capacity to shape the existence of categories, to create new categories of meaning. Now, one good example of this is in the creation of what can be called true fans or super fans. The music industry, from everyone from artists to booking agents, they're obsessed with trying to figure out who the true fans are and separating them from the feeble, the meek listener who just listens a couple times and doesn't really care. They need to separate these two so they can concentrate on the first one. As one manager told me, we don't aim to have as many SoundCloud subscribers as possible, but we try to have as many good subscribers as possible. But how do you distinguish between a good subscriber and a bad subscriber? What are the data points? What's a true fan, and how do you distinguish it from a false fan? Well, I talked to the CEO of a London-based analytics firm, and he gave me this answer. He said, for us, live data is really important because they are the real fans. Anyone who's willing to leave their house and actually go and watch a band is definitely far more important to you than someone who's just played it on a playlist. It's too easy to press save, but to actually pay money and go watch a band, that's the real fan. Now, it sounds reasonable, but whether or not you agree with this definition of what a true fan is beside the point. The point is that this demonstrates the constitutive power of data, where a new category can emerge, where a new category called a true fan can emerge, and you can actually decide which data points you include to determine who this true fan is. And this, of course, sets in motion a whole other range of judgments and actions, because if a true fan is somebody who goes to a live show, well, then you're going to actually focus all your attention on people who have the money or the capacity to go to live shows. And as you all know, live shows are quite expensive. Another example of this constitutive power is about how booking agents look at how to better match venues with acts, right? If you have, if you're a band here and you want to find the best venue to play in Florence, how are you going to choose that best venue? Well, one CEO of an intermediary told me this. You would look at all these data points. You'd say, what are the police reports? What incidents were there at this venue? Then if you were actually getting Instagram feeds on location, you can actually start reading the facials from the crowd to see how happy they are, right? What was the mood of the crowd at that show? He continues that obviously following the tweets you would do, and then you can get sentiments from tweets, and you can get a certain amount of sentiment from YouTube, etc. Bleeding that all together, and you get a feeling of how people react to a band. So this changes the... What's interesting here is how datafication is creeping into the live context. It's not just about online, but it's how people experience music offline and how that gets tracked. And just as with the previous example of how you identify true fans, here the collection and analysis of data from live performances has constitutive power. It has the power to redefine what constitutes a good performance versus a bad one. So rather than just selling out all your tickets, number of bums in seats, it's more detailed than that. It's how many smiles on their faces, how people reacted, whether there were any police incidents. All these types of things start feeding into what is considered a good performance versus a bad one. Now finally, the last example of constitutive power that I want to give you is how data is changing the way we categorize music. Now for a long time we categorized music by genre. And this had very real reasons for it. When you walk into a record shop, and if you're a rock fan, you go straight to that section, you know where it is, you can avoid classical or hip-hop or whatever. But there's no real natural biological need for this, right? As one data analyst told me, everyone's been doing genre-based reporting, right? They're following this old system up till now, which is nonsense, because increasingly people are consuming music through playlists. I see this when I talk to my students in the Netherlands. A lot of them, rather than listening to albums or genres on Spotify, they're listening to specific playlists. And playlists are based on mood. Sunday morning chill. What is that? It's not a genre. It has several different genres in there. It has jazz, funk, and maybe classical in there. So it's all around mood, or context, you could say. So how might intermediaries adapt to this shift, and how might this actually change how people categorize music? Well, he says, one example would be putting mood tags into music data. We take those tags and put them into metadata. Then we can start doing more intelligent reporting around what's resonating with your fan base. What are the most popular moods in certain times of the day? And what tracks fit what moods? Is it Adele always just when you are depressed? Obviously, what's interesting in this is how, what kind of data points will they use to indicate what moods, right? How are they going to figure out if you're depressed or happy? What are the sources of data that they're going to use for this? How will particular artists or particular tracks be associated with particular moods? How will that shape how music is consumed and organized? So all three of these examples give you a sense of the constitutive power of infomediation, the capacity to alter and even create new categories through which music and musicians are valued and valorized. And this brings us to our central point as I'm going to wrap up. Infomediaries do not simply model the world, right? They're not just any type of representation. There's always an act of representation. They perform this world into being. Cultural infomediaries have long shaped how culture is represented and presented, and how culture is valued and evaluated. But increasingly, a whole host of different platforms, like some of the ones I showed you just today, are kind of coming in between the artist and the listener, and are changing how music is experienced through the analysis, visualization of huge amounts of data. But the important point is that these infomediaries, these platforms that analyze data, are always acting alongside and in relation to the interpretive work of traditional cultural intermediaries, like artist managers, like A&R representatives, and so forth. As one scholar says, data never speaks, it must be spoken for. The question of who does the speaking and in which language they speak in will affect the shape of the music industry and the sound of music for years to come. Thank you.